So just to kick off, I'm going to give Tom the floor for a minute because he hasn't spoken or presented. But I just wanted to give him a few minutes to talk a little bit about what Silver Spring's network's doing and what they're doing with IPSO Alliance. So we've got a full range of groups here, not labs, IPSO Alliance and TM Forum. So that's where the conversation will go. But I'll hand over to Tom to start off.
All right, thanks, Tim. So I just wanted to spend a minute. I'm new to the OMA Alliance. This is my first visit, and so it's been very interesting to see the discussions today, and they're very much in line with discussions that we're having at Silver Spring Networks. So Silver Spring, for those of you who haven't heard of us before, we are a company that has been primarily working in smart grid, and so we have instrumented 15 million electric meters that are deployed primarily in unlicensed band spectrum. And we then take that and through what are at this point proprietary APIs, manage that and manage the devices and pull the information back to our back office service. So as we're looking to go forward, one of the things that we do right now is that we have a ratio of approximately 5,000 devices to 1 in terms of what we have deployed to where it goes to a cellular backhaul, which is the typical way we deploy. The next generation we're looking at is to get the cellular connection much closer to the end device, where in many deployments we'll take that ratio from 5,000 to 1 to 100 to 1. And in some deployments, it may be appropriate for that to go to 1 to 1, where every device that we deploy actually has a cellular connection. So we're looking at different models of how we could deploy that, different ways where we could deconstruct what at this point is a very vertically integrated system into components, and looking at how we can work with other members of the supply chain in providing the system and solution to do that. As we move forward, we're also looking to go a little more broadly and deal with some adjacent markets such as smart city, and so we have a variety of streetlight projects that we're working on now. Okay. All right. So that's an introduction to Silver Spring. My role at Silver Spring is that I'm responsible for standards and technologies, mainly from the technology side, I would say architecture. So again, talk about APIs all day. So I guess shifting gears a bit then, let's talk about the IPSO Alliance. So the IPSO Alliance is Internet Protocol for Smart Objects. So we were co-located with you earlier in the week. I'm not sure how many knew who we were or what we do. The hope was to have some cross-pollination between conversations and people at OMA and people who were here to visit us or to join our members meeting with the IPSO Alliance. So IPSO is focused on the concept that machine-to-machine or the Internet of Things should actually involve the Internet Protocol. That's not always universally assumed. I think many from cellular providers or vendors often look at it as the Internet Protocol is an unnecessary layer. At IPSO, we would say that actually being able to be transport agnostic is very important for the success of the application and of deploying devices. And there could be a variety of network types that are used to aggregate and connect these devices. Beyond just IPv4 or IPv6, we also think that it's important to use the Internet approach or Internet framework of appropriate layering and all the way up through application level protocols like HTTP or potentially CoAP or other protocols being discussed at that layer. The open question I have in my mind with both hats on, both my IPSO hat and my Silver Spring Networks hat, is what organizations are going to help us to define the schemas that go on the top, the XML, JSON, whatever those happen to be, that I think actually are a lot of the APIs that we'll be working with going forward. And so, as an attendee, what I'm looking at is what role does OMA have? And I'm hoping to answer that question before I go.
So I suppose the question is, on the basis of the presentations and conversations that you've heard today, what types of areas do you think, are there, from the point of view of the discussions that have taken place on OTT and the APIs that are used there, do you see commonality there and areas where there are places that OMA and IPSO Alliance can work together?
I think there certainly are. Again, I'm certainly seeing the same questions being asked. I'm not sure I understand the answers yet. And I think also as, a company focused, and again, an organization focused on Internet of Things or machine to machine, a lot of times, a smartphone solution doesn't really fit us. It doesn't fit us in a variety of ways. We have no user to type the password. We don't have a $650 device to deploy with all of the, the quad-core ARM processor, however many gig of RAM, whatever. Our devices cost order of magnitudes less. And so it's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all solution, and I'm not sure that as people are looking to deploy services to provide, different pieces in the value-add chain, if we're necessarily top of mind in what they're thinking about offering.
So just to sort of raise from the floor, are there any questions on IPSO Alliance and the work that Tom's been talking about?
Actually, have one question.
Oh. Brian's got a question.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think with regard to creation of schemas for Internet of Things devices, OMA has been working specifically on a tool to enable the creation of managed objects in a very easy way that conform to the OMA specifications for lightweight machine-to-machine.
Great, looking forward to reading it.
Good, so there's some place. So I just wanted to come back on some of the earlier conversations, from the TM point of view. You mentioned about the fact that there was speculation on, or you wanted to perhaps speculate on why there were operators pulling back on operator billing. Do you want to sort of talk a little more to that?
Not particularly. I thought it might be interesting if anyone had reasons that they wanted to put forward. I just thought it was fascinating to see that something so apparently advantageous was being abandoned more rapidly than it was being adopted.
Nobody with any other comments? Okay. Anyone else want to? So no speculation on that, unfortunately.
Complete speculation on my part, but I think a lot of people think about things like payments as being about transferring a number from column A to column B. And it's really a business that's more about risk management. And if you don't understand that business, then odds are that you won't be moving digits between columns for very long. And I think that's really the heart of some of the movement that you see there.
So again, to look at some of the points you were making. So how could, you were doing things like hackathons directly with developers, talking to them and getting feedback. Do you think that it's areas like that that OMA can use, or how can we learn from the types of things that you've done to improve the way that we're developing within OMA those APIs?
So I think agile processes, both development style like hackathons and internal agile development processes like agile requirement specification, agile spec development, and agile implementation are all something that would benefit any standards development organization. And we're happy to share our experiences. There's really no substitute for attending a hackathon, as Michelle could testify as a judge. There's nothing quite like it, but it is just one facet of the developer experience in just one of the many developer communities, and not necessarily the only or most important one either. And I think some of the other presentations today touched on that, some of the different groups of stakeholders that use your APIs.
Because there's been a lot of conversation, I would say, that I've come across with developer communities talking about the pros and cons of doing hackathons versus almost just going out to developers and potentially just paying specific developers to give you that feedback. What's your view on the sort of balance between using something like a hackathon and just literally working with a small range of specifically chosen developers?
I would look at the type of developer that's trying to be attracted. I think it's relatively easy to get a very large number of developers together for not that much of an investment right now. If it's the startup type mentality, if you're looking for feedback from enterprise developers, I would go more of a workshop route and more of a targeted session where you're actually inviting them in, maybe getting them together during work hours. They're probably not going to show up for a weekend hackathon, and maybe get their employers to sponsor their engagement.
Okay. Any other?
Well, the dilemma is then making sure that you have still internet type mentality even for the enterprise guys, because in a sense, when you look at today enterprise architecture, there is an evolution of what enterprise architecture should look like from a very like a ESB-centric environment to more like something Facebook or Google have within the enterprise, because they don't have this notion of bus in the middle. And that's the dilemma, because in a sense, it's very quick to come back to a more classic environment, especially if vendors who have a vested interest to keep a certain status quo are coming into the play.
And last one for you, John, was you were talking about how you manage many relationships in terms of trying to develop or work with the long tail. I don't think you really sort of went into how that could be done.
Right, that's something that we're actually getting some working sessions on coming up in December, and then also at our Action Week in February. Basically, the idea is to somewhat radically rethink the existing business processes and partnership processes that are currently associated with creating and onboarding a partner. They're extremely heavyweight, they're extremely legalistic right now, they're top-heavy with many more layers of SLA than they need. And the idea is to kind of turn that on its head and end up with something where you could onboard somebody in a day for a commercial relationship that might last for a day or it might last for a year, but it's not the enterprise-to-enterprise relationship that currently characterizes most partnership and onboarding processes.
Thanks, John. Seth.
Yes, hi. Seth Newberry, Open Mobile Alliance. Oh, I'm sorry, Kenny, I thought you had spoken. One of the things I found interesting about the conversations that we've had so far in this event was that they were, the examples and the use cases were almost always about fairly large and fairly complex applications. Every one of you, you've got really consumer-facing applications that we're talking about APIs for. We've got concerns about the security of the APIs and so forth. But what I thought was interesting was Thomas's view of the Internet of everything, the IoT world, where these are very small, very precise, very simple devices that wake up once in a while and tell you something. So how do you, on the panel, think that the APIs will change as a market for kind of creating objects and applications in the machine-to-machine world will change?
So it's funny because I worked a long time ago in a startup which was doing this type of things, and the situation is more understanding that there is a demarcation between the device and the application, and API will remain an API. Now, what we're talking about is the fact that instead of having an API implemented by a backend, a complex backend, an API actually can be implemented by a device or by a chain of elements which are between the physical device and the actual consumer of the device through an API. But the point is, if there is a point, and that's where for me M2M should get into, there is a point where an application developer will only deal with API and actually doesn't have to worry about how complex or how sophisticated the implementation of these APIs are. Because otherwise you get back to a dichotomy of this type of things are different from this type of thing, but actually they are not. Now, the point is what is the value chain or the elements needed to go from there to a super simple device, yeah, that's what the complexity of the implementation will rely. And that's where the opportunity for a lot of people to step in. But at some point, there is an API, and the API doesn't need to be different if it's a small device or a huge backend application.
Well, I guess I have a slightly different view in that really want to see end-to-end APIs as much as possible and avoid gateways and transformations and intermediate systems to the extent possible, which means that the end constrained device does really have the API that's talking to the back office. And I can't tell you what a large percentage of my time is spent discussing issues like that API is too heavyweight for this small device. I can't believe you expect an embedded system to do XML. Are you stupid or what? Those sort of conversations happen every day at my office. The level of cryptography appropriate for the application versus what's appropriate for the machine. I think that eventually Moore's Law solves all of this, but we have to deliver product in the meantime. And so it's a constant battle and discussion.
Rajiv?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the magic things that happens about these, while it's undesirable, is that your trust models may end up changing, and you may end up with different mechanisms by which some of these transactions happen between, let's say, a device with lesser capability, intermittent connectivity, inability to perform a full trust chain, and whether that's then introducing an intermediary as a gateway or a distinguished protocol. I think in the end, there's desirable things there, undesirable, but there's certainly workable solutions in each of those areas.
Yeah, I think just one quick example on that is, with a security hat on, everybody always wants to encrypt everything. And encrypting everything solves a lot of your problems in that you maybe in some ways don't have to think about things to the level that you would have to think about them otherwise. It's encrypted, it's good, we've covered it. Well, a lot of times with a constrained device, a crypto operation is very heavyweight and would really potentially change the footprint of your application beyond what your price point for the hardware is. And so sometimes you have to do some very hard thinking on, is this really a privacy issue, or is there some reason why this data is actually secret? Or is it acceptable to just do an integrity check, a cryptographically secure integrity check, but say that, no, for this application that's valid. It's not private, but we just have to make sure that it really is the data.
Well, and the interesting thing is also the fact that the paradigm is changing on what do you need to protect? Do you need to protect the assets, or you need to protect the consumption of the asset? And in a sense, today, more and more people are saying you need just to protect the assets, because I actually don't know how the assets will be consumed. Otherwise, I will have to know all the application and all the things everybody will develop, which basically will be very impossible. And that's where, for me, and that has been I know that has been a fight when I was at Vodafone, what is end-to-end. See, because in a sense, end-to-end for operators was always been from the back end to the user experience in a device on like a very precise view, almost like the button and so forth. Today, end-to-end becomes I stop at the API because how the thing will be consumed is not me anyway, so how can I control what I actually don't even see? And that's where you will start to see more like kind of like a value chain where end-to-end will, for every company, will start at some point and stop at some point, because that's what they will be accountable for, and the rest will be open to other discussion. And I know that we had this discussion at the TMF level. Interestingly, a lot of vendors are coming and trying to give you a new machinery to do a true end-to-end, which makes the whole thing impossible to implement. But I guess that model will have to be modified in order to handle proper open environment.
Just a couple of quick notes. I think you could make the same argument against end-to-end as you could make with cryptography being, if it's too heavyweight to do cryptography, perhaps it's too heavyweight to support end-to-end. I think the trade-off is going to be Moore's law versus the exponential increase in data rates needed to actually do monitoring, performance, and quality service management. And what I'm seeing now is a lot of the metrics collection that's being done isn't even on what I would call an API. They're using RDP, right? And people go through the same shock when they look at RDP. Well, that's not an API. It's just like a few years ago, I was debating with people that said, well, REST isn't a real API. You have to use SOAP. We have to be aware that we're going to go through the same, changes of mindset. We're vulnerable to the same prejudices and getting stuck in our way of thinking as whoever we were arguing with a few years ago. So.
Okay. Kenny.
I'd like to perhaps direct a question, probably Rajiv. Are you aware of any empirical study that kind of justify moving from two-factor authentication to three-factor authentication? Or would it potentially be an overkill? And I have a second follow-up part. Thank you.
Sure. So we have actually, there's an organization called the Ponemon, organization run by a gentleman called Larry Ponemon. And we did a study with Larry when I was at PGP on the cost of a data breach, so he's probably very well known for that. So we commissioned an independent study to go back and ask about end user attitudes towards different types of authentication. And so I can reference that study from an end user perspective. And it's quite fascinating. I think that the punchline there is diversity rules, heterogeneity rules. And people are very willing, they're so fed up with passwords that they'll take, they're very willing to do things like biometrics, which you would have expected some kind of resistance on. They're very willing to go out and actually buy little tokens to carry around with them. So there's a fair willingness to mix and match, et cetera, on the end user side. On the relying party side, I'd like to say that there really is no single pattern. It's really dependent on your business and what that business from a risk profile can sustain. Because eventually there's a trade-off. And the trade-off is in a shifting set of attacks that are going to happen if your business represents a juicy target. So is two-factor enough? Would you consider a smartphone with trust zone and a secure element with code isolation and keys being secured as one factor or two factors? I think there's some of those kinds of arguments that you can have. I think at the end of the day, what we have to do is to create building blocks that allow people to very quickly, very cheaply mix and match and deploy the range of security that's appropriate for them from a business perspective and a risk perspective. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. The quick second part question is, knowing what you've explained about the multi-modes of local authentication, I wonder if you have any forethought or advice to primarily, I think a large part of the OMA represents the kind of mobile phone, mobile carrier concerns. In that environment, particularly deal with the mobile device, one can easily visualize that we could start following, at least, if not adapting some of the vital approaches for authenticating the user with the device. Are there any, is there a big opening there that you're seeing, or are there already movement to try to include that specific scenario?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think several of the speakers ahead of me have talked about perhaps identity as an interesting role for some of the carriers to step into. There's a lot of nuance there because I think every time someone says identity, as I said, they mean a lot of different things. There's low assurance identity, which are for things like personalization, customization of ads or physical environments. And then there's high stakes stuff, whether it's payments or national security. And so I think those are all interesting businesses that can be stepped into by the folks in this room. I fully anticipate that some of you will be running the full stack, some of you will be running part of the stack and creating interesting businesses out of those. Again, I'd point back to what we're trying to do in the FIDO Alliance is simply create that building block. So which part of that building block can you use for what purposes? Well, the first thing is if you use something like the FIDO protocols, then you have the first advantage of being able to simplify some of that back-end infrastructure that today has to deal with authentication on a per device, per authentication method basis. The other kind of benefits that accrue are you can micro-segment your populations in terms of how you actually deliver out identity assurance, because for the high-risk guys, you can go in, use Arm Trust Zone and a TEE and secure element and deliver fairly high assurance identity assertions. And for consumers, you can work off of a software-based PIN. Finally, I think there's a role to play, particularly in the event that you actually own as the carrier the device that has been given to the end user, whether it's a cable box or whether it's a handset or something like that, to develop unique authenticators. Today we speak about what I'd call unimodal authentication, a fingerprint or a face or a pin or something like that. Obviously, there's no reason why you can't combine 16 of these into a very strong assertion regarding the veracity of that particular user. As perhaps the operator, who that user is because they presented themselves physically at the time of enrollment or acquisition of the device. You may have the ability to characterize that device in very unique methods that are very interesting to relying parties. So I think all of those represent opportunities to build interesting authenticators and to expose interesting back-end assurances related to the identity that you can then verify.
Thank you. Brian?
Thanks, Tim. I've got a couple of questions. Going back to, I think it might have been something that John was talking about, that we have to rethink business processes, make them more rapid, make it possible to implement SLAs in a day. Okay, so this was a theme that actually we saw as well in the work that we were doing in the Open Identity Exchange. One of the biggest inhibitors to federation of identity in that space was the complexity of creating contracts, indemnification, et cetera, and the fact that there was no system whereby you could discover the metadata associated with trust frameworks. And they have this goal still of developing a trust framework they're calling OIXNet, or at least a metadata repository for that, right? So what do you see, though, thinking about that, as the role of this sort of inhibitor and any solutions to it with regard to APIs? So if we say we have discovery, right, we've solved that problem. Say we have, I don't know that we have. Do you see that there's a great inhibitor in kind of the automated arrangement for access and discovery of detailed capabilities, et cetera, that would be necessary, I think, to, as I pointed out earlier, to support a federated environment in which you have a diversity of API implementations. So there's a couple of questions there. One is the automated nature of this, the onboarding. The other is the discovery of capabilities. How much are those inhibitors?
Well, part of the discussion would be around automation and use of templates, and we already have some significant work done with requirements and specifications for SLAs there, and the implementation for that is following for the first version of the SLA management API. And that'll be one of the enablers that's needed. But I think the general problem with partnerships and onboarding is much more of a business process and legal problem than it is an API problem. The APIs can be there. We've done demonstrations with non-TM Forum APIs. Some of them were actually OMA APIs that involved discovery, identity, payment, and set up a complete scenario where small OTT players were able to, in a demonstration version, onboard and partner with operators. And that was demonstrated actually in a federated environment that exists today that has been implemented, and there's a consortium of operators. But in talking to the people that work behind there, they tell me that the biggest obstacle to get that consortium to work is that they can't get the commercial departments of the operators to talk to each other. That is the biggest problem. I mean, the technology's there. It's that somebody lacks the will to do it is all I can conclude.
Yes, speaking as someone who lived through the PKI industry, what I can tell you is that the technology will be there, but you really won't be able to find an easy way to automate this for all possible use cases. I think it's certainly possible to tackle it on a domain at a time. And we saw that in the PKI days with the financial industry moving with things like Bolero and Identrus and other kinds of efforts where they understood clearly what the semantics associated with that particular transaction were and what kinds of indemnity or risk containment needed to be done. And they had standard industry contracts that pointed to a way to get that done. I think doing that in a general API sense, to me, doesn't make a ton of sense. I think you can provision someone, but I think on aspects like contracts and such, it's really an industry-specific thing.
Did you have another question, Brian?
Yeah, I do. Different question. So, y'all are probably aware of the kind of the significance of the discussion around internet hardening lately. IETF, for example, W3C, this was recently, there's a lot of discussion about, changing the fundamental protocol of the internet, HTTP, so that it is, inherently secure. It is basically an end-to-end secure pipe, and we're trying to work with IETF to be sure that, metadata as necessary that support intermediaries, the function of intermediaries, I think it was mentioned gateways, for example, for M2M, that this metadata is visible. And that, in essence, encryption, high-strength encryption, right, is going to be a mandatory requirement for any user plane data. How do you see this impacting either or both the machine-to-machine market with regard to analytics, anything that's supported by deep packet inspection, for example, in terms of the network, and also how do you see it impacting the way that apps can access APIs if they're accessing APIs over a inherently secure connection in which only the client and the server see anything of value, right? How will that change the nature of the way the APIs and authorization is implemented? So there's two questions there. Sorry.
So a few issues. I think we covered a little bit of it earlier just in terms of, if all HTTP transactions have strong crypto, that probably won't be appropriate for all Internet of Things devices, and I think that's an issue. Some of the recent things in the news, unfortunately I wasn't at IETF 2 weeks ago, I had to go to a smart grid meeting, but the reports I heard out of that, it's going to be an issue when our hardware has hardware acceleration for algorithms that now some of our non-US customers or even some of our US customers are questioning as being secure. So I think that we have a variety of challenges in front of us.
I think for those of you who haven't followed this particular issue, I'd strongly urge you to go to YouTube, look for the IETF channel, and just listen to that. I think that the argument is that we've inadvertently created an environment with the standards and the implementations that we've rolled out that's turned the internet into a giant surveillance machine. And I think it's politically very difficult to argue about the merits of placing limitations. And therefore the reaction from some of the folks who spoke there was your only bet there is to make it really, really hard. And one way to make it hard is to strengthen those protocols and encrypt material as it's flowing to make surveillance something that's not something that's a default and easy to achieve. So to your question about where and how does this impact? At least I know that in the community that we interact with frequently, and whether that's vendors, some folks from national government infrastructure, because remember, this applies both ways, right? There's a loss of confidence in U.S. vendors that's taking place as a result of this. There's damage accruing to U.S. companies because some of these flaws or issues related to some of the crypto compromises are not being surfaced as fast as they should. So I think it's incumbent on us as a community to try and create at least a robust set of options for that to be rolled out. Whether you then choose to operate it in the most secure mode or not is a choice that you do have, but it has to be designed into the protocols and infrastructures that we are designing.
And in a sense, all of this strong encryption thing will not stop the fact that there will still be boundaries, and that where the API arrive. Like if you talk to Dropbox, at what point they will stop saying I don't secure anymore? What does the end for them is? Whether another company will have to take then charge of the other part, and that's, for me, you could argue that again, scope is very important, and boundaries will still exist anyway. Because commercially, otherwise it will be impossible to basically have a bunch of people who will be a carrier, and then a few companies who will be end-to-end provider of overall security. But that's a model which doesn't introduce the notion of the fact that you will have tons of services out there, which will all of them have API, which will be very secure from their perspective up to a specific end, which doesn't mean that it's completely end-to-end again.
Okay.
So just one follow-up question to my question, and I'll sit down. So I've described in OMA in previous discussions about takeaways from Cloud Identity Summit and Over the Top that one of the responses to this particular challenge, basically the pipe being secure, is to move enablers down to the device. Okay, for example, identity, et cetera, to open up device enablers through APIs so that we are not shut out in terms of what we can do in the network. We have a device platform in which is open, and we can do that. So I'll sit down. But what are your thoughts about the role of device-based identity, for example, as a way to address the hardening of the internet and still be able to provide personalized services to users?
I guess I have an opinion. I think the notion of device-based identity is wonderful. There's a trade-off, right? And the trade-off is in terms of privacy and user expectations. And I think by and large, users are relatively generous with it until somebody goes out and does egregious abuse, and then you'll see the pendulum swing back the other direction. I think it's up to us, again, from a community that designs infrastructures and protocols. It's certainly possible to create these identifiers in a manner that they are not linkable across sites. And that's a very simple, relatively straightforward set of science that's been out there for a while, not widely implemented, but certainly available for people to work on. Will that guarantee absolute privacy and security? Probably not. But again, from a core design perspective, if you do that well, it's possible to provide a good mix of the two, which is strong security in one-to-one relationships as expected by the user while still preserving non-linkability.
Right, so I'm going to cut this presentation